everybody, welcome back. We are at the halfway mark in our preparation for the external exam. And that probably means that we're moving away now from just deconstructing the text and looking at what happens inside the text to really looking at connecting with materials outside and around the text. So what that normally means is building our contextual understanding of Jacobean England, of the history of the church, of big ideas like the Great Chain of Being or the Divine Right of Kings, but also connecting with literary criticism and literary commentary. So little books like the Harold Bloom analysis of King Lear, a number of other Shakespearean scholars like A.C. Bradley, are people whose work you can read to help develop your own ideas about what the text means to you. So we're so lucky that these are texts that have been studied and studied and studied. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look at the connections that other people have made and let the words that those people have chosen help us to build connections for ourselves. Yes, we're going to have to write our own essay. And yes, we are probably going to argue positions that have been argued before. But sometimes reading the work of other scholars helps us personally to just make a little connection and find a great word maybe that helps us to express our evaluation of a text in our own unique way. So for the next couple of weeks, I do really want you to be engaging with what other people think. And that is something we can add to our data wall, which has started really well with our analysis of characters. And we're going to look at plot this week. We can add small little bits of commentary about what other scholars have said about King Lear to diversify our own understanding and to support each other. And in about 2 weeks, when we finish that, obviously our focus is on the essay specifically and the mock paper. And that means for that, we're also going to have to work quite deliberately with the process of analysis when the goal is writing an essay. Okay, so we can engage in analysis, and in fact, we have been for the last 7 weeks, where our focus is on understanding the text. So we went in with the goal of understand this story. We've done that now. And so we change our goal and we decide what it is that we want to achieve next. We're a bit like Edmund in that regard. And the thing that we want to achieve next from our analysis is the ability to answer a question. So that question is going to give us our parameters that we have to work in. Once we have those parameters, we will then deconstruct and analyze the text, not broadly and accessing everything that's in the play, but specifically with reference to what that question asks us to do. We're going to find our patterns, we're going to compare and contrast, and then we're going to offer an evaluation where ultimately we hope the evaluation we offer is reasonable and it makes sense in light of the evidence we could find, the patterns we explored, and the question that we were asked. But today, our focus is thematic analysis, and specifically the theme of family and legitimacy. So before I put the PowerPoint up, something I'd like you to take about this idea of family and legitimacy is that each of these words has both a positive and a negative connotation. We need to know that because this is a tragedy. If this is a happy ending and our characters all ultimately enjoyed great success and got married and celebrated, then we would look at the positive connotations of the word family and see that as central to their success. But because it's a tragedy, because this is a play that results in so many deaths, and not just deaths of anyone, but deaths of the main characters, we have to consider the significance of the family connection and the legitimate the legitimacy question in the role that those things play in the downfall of the characters. So when we think about the positive connotations of a word like family, we are talking about shared values and history and unity and trust and faith and support. And that's great. And when we think about the positive connotations of the word legitimacy, if I separate it from family, the word legitimacy is synonymous with truth and goodness and authenticity. And that sounds entirely positive. But in a tragedy, we've got to think about how something so important and central could be subverted. There's that word again. So when we subvert the idea of family and we focus on its negative connotations instead, we think about the relationship you didn't choose. So the relationship you have with parents who you didn't choose to have as your parents, and the way in which that relationship exists, but ultimately might reveal really significant differences in who you are as a person from who your parents are, or vice versa. That the negative connotations can also be around restriction, around the isolation caused by having to, or the insular nature of having to be at one with your family to the exclusion of something else. That certainly played out in some of our other tragedies, not so much this one. If I think about the negative connotations associated with the idea of legitimacy, well, the obvious thing to do is to add that prefix, ill. And when we focus on illegitimacy instead, the use of that word, just that one word, suggests that a character is devalued, that their background matters more than who they are. So just say that again, that their background, the thing that they had no control over, matters more than all the decisions they've made themselves. And, you know, Edmund just enunciates that so well for us when he talks about the idea that man is so flawed in their belief that they can blame their flaws and their shortcomings on the stars, as though they didn't take charge of them, take charge of their actions all the way through. You know, whatever his failings and regardless of his ultimate downfall, Edmund stands by his convictions. His actions are his actions, and he is not going to allow the illegitimacy that he could not control be the thing that defines him. He will define him. Okay, so let's have a look at this PowerPoint, and we're considering the way in which the vehicle of legitimacy, we're examining the way in which the theme of legitimacy is carried by a whole lot of vehicles through the play. So different devices that help to explore the idea, the big idea of family and legitimacy in a range of different ways. And each of these vehicles could then be the central idea of an argument. Alrighty. So the first actually of the stylistic devices that are relevant to the idea of family and legitimacy is actually the stylistic device of a dual storyline, or as we most commonly would refer to it in Shakespeare as a main plot and then a subplot. And certainly we can see that not only is the use of a main plot and a subplot present in King Lear, it is central to exploring the theme of family. Because in both of our storylines, the toxicity or the flawed nature of a family relationship is explored. Now, what it is that is flawed in each of the families is different, and how the characters go about resolving it is different, but family is central to both of the storylines. So the first of the stylistic devices that you could actually explore is the dual storyline, and you could look at that as juxtaposition between the father characters and the child characters. You could look at it as a plot technique, the use of a subplot, and deconstruct it that way. But regardless of how you refer to it, the dual storylines would be a stylistic device that you could analyze for the way in which family and legitimacy is presented. The key idea in both of these stories, of course, is that family is flawed. Where does that flaw come from? Well, given the way that these stories end, it ultimately is left with our father figures. But those father figures are not to be representative of just fathers. They're actually representative of society and society's values. So when we think about what it is that we as readers are supposed to take from the message about legitimacy and family, we need to think about what it is that society, that we as members of society should be doing better or differently, so that this central family unit is one that encourages positive growth, not one which breeds toxicity. And so some questions that we can actually ask ourselves there is, do you think that adult children have a responsibility to show compassion to elderly parents? Do you think that children should always show respect to their parents? Like, is there a respect that parents earn simply by virtue of a life of greater experience? Once children are adults, is there a change in that dynamic? If the family, even if the relationship has been acrimonious as the child has been growing up, do those children then have a responsibility to be better people when their own parents are elderly? So with that in mind, the first, or second, I guess it is, stylistic device that you could analyze is characterization. I just have to stop, and I'm sure you've already read ahead and looked at this, and deconstruct the names of our three characters. This is important to think about. So King Lear, and we assume his wife, have 3 daughters. And when the world is ordered and the well-being of the kingdom is progressing as one would expect, because the king is the legitimate ruler and he is the manifestation of God's will on earth, and he is ensuring the order and survival and longevity of his whole kingdom. The naming of his daughters will represent the best things that a king can give his kingdom. Okay, so if everyone was positive, these 3 names would have entirely positive connotations. So Goneril, as we frequently joke, does actually see that the origins of her name come from the Latin referring to the genitalia. This is not to be perceived crudely. Goneril and her husband could have been or should be responsible for the fertility of the kingdom. Their marriage, their union can be representative of all of the ways in which the kingdom may flourish. The crops will grow and the cattle will continue to be fertile, and in addition to producing calves, they also produce great milk, and we win all of our battles, and our ships come home from the storms, and everything that is to do with prosperity grows out of the fertility of Goneril and her husband. Okay, so that's her name. Regan comes from regis, meaning authority and rule. So where Goneril might represent the fertility of the kingdom, the way in which the kingdom's longevity is sustained by her richness, her personal richness, Regan's name is associated with authority. So what we're talking about here is the legitimacy of a way of ruling, that England stays strong when England rules the way England always has. So again, in Regan, what we should have seen, if it was a positive connotation, is a character who is imbued with all of her father's dignity, all of her father's authority, and where her power is used for the good of others. Okay, where her power is ensures that the response to a natural disaster is compassion. The response to natural disaster is to assist your farmers and your citizens to rebuild their properties. Okay, and the third of our daughters, of course, is Cordelia. This comes as absolutely no surprise for us, particularly in an MSc school. Her name is from cordis, meaning relating to the heart. So Goneril is about the fertility of the kingdom. Regan is about the legitimacy of the kingdom as an entity, so the structure of England and the realness of England and English rule. And Cordelia is the heart. So she is about the spirit of leadership rather than perhaps the rule of leadership. And you can see that between the 3 of them, they do indeed embody exactly what you want from your authority. You know, we've got someone who is about our long-term health and well-being and fertility, the structures that keep us moving towards that long-term fertility and livability, but someone who is also ethically and morally centered. So the rule can sometimes be without ethics, is morally and ethically centered, so that the heart of the kingdom is not impacted by what the head of the kingdom needs. All right, so if all three girls were positively represented in this text, then that's what their names would embody. However, Goneril and Regan do not enjoy the positive connotations associated with their names. And so what that means is, instead of focusing on an idea like fertility, we see Goneril's name and therefore her influence on the kingdom subverted, and the negative connotations associated with her name highlighted instead. So she then becomes synonymous with something like lust, okay, or something associated with maybe sexual proclivity, promiscuity. Regan, whose name was synonymous with authority and regal leadership, now becomes is also subverted, and her name is about that big stick. Okay, so she becomes her name becomes synonymous with the cruelty needed to keep people in line. So you don't just enforce the rules, you enforce the rules by punishing those who go against them. And we certainly see that in Regan's behavior, in her desire to inflict cruelty on Lear, in her desire to inflict cruelty on Gloucester. Cordelia, of course, remains the heart of the kingdom because her character is still represented positively. However, the fact that her story ultimately ends in tragedy does still leave a cautionary tale for us. Heart without head can ultimately be as destructive as head without heart. Okay, so thinking without feeling could lead to decisions that are possible but not ethical, and feeling without thinking could result in someone whose leadership is ultimately vague and formless. So all three girls together, of course, would have been a super queen, and the kingdom would have flourished. So through the characterization of Lear and his children, we can certainly explore both the positive and negative connotations of family, and a message that the issue that we have to keep coming back to is who is responsible for the way that these characters behave. So if the girls are so horrible, are they this way because Lear failed as a parent? Did Lear fail as a parent, or did he believe that his authority as king would ultimately do the job without him actually explicitly parenting them? And we certainly get a hint that he has intertwined his two roles in Act 1, Scene 1. You know, which of you shall we say doth love us most? So that use of the royal we, love us most, does not necessarily sound like a dad saying, so which of you loves me? That sounds like a king demanding something of his subjects. So it's not a huge surprise that the answer he gets is also inauthentic, because the person answering is acknowledging that they have to answer the king, who is also their father. So they're pandering to the ego of an old man. They're protecting themselves quite pragmatically from being accused of treason by the king. And ultimately, when he is no longer the king, they do not even have to respect him as their dad. So the treatment of Lear by Regan and Goneril through Act 1 and 2 highlights the fact that, stripped of his authority, he has no power. He cannot punish them for what they do to him, because he's a toothless tiger now. And what that then reveals is their cruelty as individuals, in the fact that they would hurt an old man rather than being the better people, and recognizing that they have an option, they have a responsibility to be the best they can be, regardless of how they were treated. All right. When we think about the Gloucesters have a different problem in their family. We could say that, well, we do say that Lear's biggest failing is his hubris. So his arrogance and his failure to recognize that his arrogance is actually getting in the way. So the Gloucesters have a different problem at their heart of their family. And it is that Gloucester and Edgar are blind. So they're blind to the ways in which the way they speak to Edmund impacts him, and the way in which their failure to recognize his legitimacy has set them up for failure. So Gloucester, as a gentleman, can't perceive of evil in anyone. But rather than simply stopping there and saying, I can't conceive of evil in anyone, Edmund, you are my son, and it doesn't really matter whether I was married to your mum or not, you're my son, and I love you. Just leave it there, and we'd have a different story. But that's not what he says. He emphasizes his illegitimacy, and that then erodes, of course, anything that Gloucester has said about love, because it's always conditional. All right. Edgar is very like his father. He's cut from the same cloth. He is a chivalrous man who believes that, as someone who has imbued himself with honesty and compassion and goodness and hospitality his whole life, that everybody else has those qualities as well, including his own brother. And as a result, he has no reason to doubt that Edmund is lying. And so this process then of Edmund manipulating both his father and his brother is made so much easier, because they can't conceive that the problem that they're facing is actually from him. And I've looked at the idea of a paradox as a literary device that's central to the Gloucester story. So if we're thinking about literary terminology that we could put into our analysis to add a little bit of a dimension and to show that we've really deconstructed this text, we could think about a paradox. So a paradox is a statement that appears at first to be contradictory and on reflection makes sense. The literary device is commonly used to engage readers to discover an underlying logic in a contradictory statement. So in our Gloucester story, Gloucester gives legitimacy to Edmund's claims of Edgar's corruptions without a moment's thought. So despite the fact he has actively highlighted and foregrounded Edmund's illegitimacy, he immediately supports his claims. Edgar is stripped of his legitimacy as heir to the title. So we just accept Edmund's point of view and we just take Edgar's title like that. Edgar protects himself by abandoning his legitimacy as a gentleman and taking on a guise. And that guise reveals a whole lot of inconsistencies in the treatment of people. So this idea of chivalry is a very thin veneer over society, because when Edgar is poor Tom, he sees the way that people treat those members of society who are disenfranchised and disempowered. He suffers physical abuse and people spit on him and he's left out in the cold, etc., etc. When he confesses as poor Tom to a range of immoralities, which he gives in his soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 2, he can use these, and he does, to justify his exile. And as a result, he just kind of seems prepared to suffer. It's quite by accident that Gloucester ends up back in his story, and that he has this ability to learn from his mistakes and move on. But obviously, he's a very good actor, because when in Act 3, Scene 4, Gloucester actually interacts with poor Tom, or interacts with Edgar as poor Tom, he is so removed from the trappings of being a gentleman that his father, again, does not see him. Okay, so what it then reveals is that this blindness is not just to the nature of his sons. The blindness is almost to people, full stop. So if you are wearing the clothes of a gentleman, you are a gentleman. Now, remember, Edmund has all the appearance of a gentleman. So if you look like you look the part, you are the part. All right. And as a result, when Edgar is poor Tom and is stripped of everything that his father would expect to see from a gentleman, his father just doesn't see him. All right. And the moment of anagnorisis and epiphany comes for Gloucester, of course, when his eyes are removed and he has to see with his heart instead. Okay, so in order to restore this really subverted story there, where families have become toxic and relationships are driven by blindness rather than clear-sightedness, which seems so rational, the only way that we can actually bring this story to an end and restore order is to restore legitimacy. So we have to have a legitimate ruler. We have to have a legitimate son bearing the name Gloucester. We have to have a father acknowledging the legitimacy of his children. We have to see a father recognize the goodness of his daughter that he exiled, and standing with that, even to his own detriment, in the face of the cruelty of his other two daughters. So Albany at the end of the story restores the expectations of chivalry, and part of that would be seeing the wicked punished. And obviously by the end of the story, the wicked have all been killed, as have many of the good characters. So the process of restoration actually starts in Act 4 with Lear's anagnorisis. So the recognition that his downfall is his own fault. And both characters in Act 4 do begin this process. And we hear that a man may see how the world goes without eyes in Act 4, Scene 6. So you don't need eyes to see that there is a cruelty to people. You don't need eyes to recognize that if you have been egotistical and dismissive of people, then that's actually what you're going to breed. So we don't need our eyes to see that. We know it in our brain. We feel it in our hearts. And following directly on from that particular line is the idea that there thou mightst behold the great image of authority, a dog's obeyed in office. So it's got nothing to do with the person and who, and their own identity. It's entirely to do with the rank they wear. So that's again showing that superficiality. And then in Act 4, Scene 7, better I were distract. So should me thoughts be severed from my griefs and woes by wrong imaginings, and lose the knowledge of themselves. So thinking about the ways in which it's better to suffer knowingly for what you have done than lose the knowledge of it and be blind to the failings. And ultimately, Lear then admits that he's a foolish, fond old man. The process of restoring order and legitimacy continues then through Act 5. Edgar has to enter the battle and stand against Edmund. Edmund reveals his true nature, or rather his actions are revealed. And that process of legitimacy comes when Edgar takes back his name. Edmund, I am Edgar and thy father's son. And that process speaks clarity, or presents clarity, presents legitimacy, and helps to restore our order. And in Edgar's final words, we actually see that legitimacy in word and deed matters as much as legitimacy in family, although the family issue is less significant, of course, by the end of the story, because all of our family units have actually been destroyed. So Edgar says, the weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel and not what we ought to say. The oldest hath borne the most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long. All right. So the weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. So there is the heart of this, the message of this story. Speak the truth, even if it means that you are banished by your father. Like, you've got to speak the truth, because at the heart of legitimacy, at the heart of the family unit, at the heart of a thriving kingdom is the truthfulness that lets people say what is right or call you out for stuff that's wrong, so that truthfulness, honesty, openness, clear-sightedness is behind the decisions that are made, rather than ego and blindness. So essentially, we take from that the message: speak the truth, respect experience, and acknowledge that all of this that happened was of their own making. And so we as audience members, of course, then take the idea that if our Hamasha is responsible for our own life's outcome, then we have to decide what it is that is going to be the driving force in our life. Are we going to be driven by hubris, arrogance, conceit, blindness, misguidedness, or are we going to recognize those faults and actively work to ensure that the relationships we build are driven by something else, and that the impact we have on other people is also driven by something more authentic and more truthful. All righty. So that's the end of this little tutorial. Again, go away, read your script for references to family. Think about that idea of subversion. So when we've got images of cruelty, how does that tie back to what you think about family when you remember that we've flipped the meaning of the word? Consider the message, how you feel you're being positioned by what you see from those characters and their interactions. Think about the way particular stylistic devices have been used to convey the significance of this idea. Go back and reread poor Tom's soliloquies and consider what it is that he reveals about his faults, his interactions with other people, the fact that he's kind of prepared to just suffer and be alive rather than be Edgar and risk death. So that's it. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Continue with your preparation. It's important to note, I think, just as we finish up in my little home office, there are three complete works of Shakespeare on the bookshelf behind me. 3. Nobody needs 3 copies of the complete works of Shakespeare, but I have 3 here and another 2 at school. So on that note, enjoy your preparation and I will see you later. Bye.